Welcome, everyone, to our session today. It's wonderful that you can all be here with us. We're very privileged to have Aris Arugay, Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, with us today. Aris is interested in research into comparative democratization, civil-military relations, social media, and strategic studies. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre is located on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. My name is Sandra Alday from the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre and zooming in from the Gamigal lands in Sydney. It always amazes me when I think about the 40,000 years of unbroken history of the First Nations in Australia. And we are indeed privileged to continue their tradition of learning from this land today. So Aris, without any further ado, I'd like to pass on to you for your roughly 20-minute talk, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. And everyone here, please feel free to send through your questions for a good discussion at the end of it. Thanks, Aris. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. It's a pleasure to do this politics update for the Philippines. Thank you so much to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre for the kind invitation to do this once again. I did this 6 years ago in 2017 in a jam-packed auditorium at the Sydney campus. And it's a pleasure to do this again on an update that focuses on elections, which I also did in 2017. So it's a pleasure to virtually meet everyone who are in the participants and those of us who will watch this after this live event. So let me quickly just share my screen. The year 2022 was one of multiple transitions for the Philippines. The country geared towards a resumption of normalcy, not seen since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. After struggling with its pandemic response, the Duterte government prevented another COVID surge, but accumulated a significant amount of fiscal debt. But the equally important transition in the country in the past year has been the political succession in the government through the 2022 national elections that were held in May 2022. In this election year, the Philippines proved once again that politics is an all-family affair. Political pedigree remained a critical political asset, as Filipinos tend to vote for trusted brands offered by political dynasties. At the same time, when populist strongmen such as Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and Jair Bolsonaro have either fallen from power or are besieged, the Philippines stood out in 2022 as a case where populist illiberalism became further consolidated and even gained an unassailable popular mandate. In May of 2022, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., son and namesake of the Philippines' former dictator, who ruled from 1965 to 1986 before being deposed in a popular uprising against human rights violations and corruption, won the presidency in an electoral victory that could only be characterized as the apex of the restoration of the Marcos political dynasty. Marcos has the distinction of being the first president in post-martial law Philippines to win an outright majority of almost 60% of the electorate. Generally regarded as Asia's oldest democracy, the Philippines is ironically also the country with the most presidential progenies in the world. So Marcos would be the third, if I'm not mistaken, with former Presidents Gloria Arroyo, a daughter, former President Macapagal, as well as former President Benigno Aquino, who's the son of former President Corazon Aquino. I titled my presentation "The Dance of the Dynasties" with an allusion to the very popular George R.R. Martin's novel turned television series, Game of Thrones. In that book series, a dance is described as a violent feud, but we're using it somehow to describe a more orthodox meaning of a dance as a unified, well-choreographed political performance to win the hearts and minds of Filipino voters. Marcos Jr. forged a formidable alliance with the outgoing President Rodrigo Duterte and preferred successor Sara Duterte as his running mate. Together with other political dynasties, the tandem presented themselves as capable of continuing the legacies of the outgoing but very popular Rodrigo Duterte. So this is to summarize some of my main points, but I would also like to say that it remains for further analysis. The 2022 elections remains to be analyzed by political observers as well as experts. But there is little doubt that the path to the presidency for Marcos was paved in the last 6 years of his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, whose attacks on liberal democratic institutions and values, as well as the use of partisan social media influencers, created an atmosphere conducive for a full-blown Marcos political comeback. By the last year of his tenure as president, Duterte has neutralized political dissent, packed the political institutions with his appointees, and effectively gutted the political opposition, a situation not seen since the brutal years of martial law. Duterte made the idea of restoring the Marcos clan not only feasible, but also political deserving. Duterte ended his term with the highest presidential approval rating since democracy was reinstalled in 1986. However, despite this personal popularity, he left the country in dire and worse conditions compared with when he assumed the presidency. In 2022, the 11% hunger incidence was higher than pre-pandemic levels, but had markedly improved from the 20% average in 2020. At the same time, poverty rate rose at the beginning of 2022 and exceeded the government's targets. As I mentioned, Duterte left office with almost $237 billion in outstanding national government debt. This is twice the figure that he inherited in 2016. The lion's share of the public expenditure program revolved around his build infrastructure spending spree. However, at the end of his term, only 12% of Duterte's 199 flagship infrastructure projects were completed, an outcome that was way below the promised boom in public infrastructure. Given his popularity, Duterte has enough level of political capital that gave him a position of strength to dictate the terms of his political succession, a position that his three predecessor presidents did not enjoy. From this point of strength, however, Duterte found it difficult to find an anointed successor, and he goes down in history as one of the presidents who did not personally endorse a presidential candidate as successor. Sara Duterte's decision to run as vice president was therefore a wrench thrown in Duterte's plans because he envisioned that her daughter would likely succeed him. And this decision was not only welcomed by Duterte's inner circle, but also by other dynasties. And therefore, Sara Duterte agreed to have an alliance with Marcos Jr. And this alliance effectively, in my view, sealed the fate of the 2022 elections in favor of the Marcos Duterte, I described the Marcos Duterte dynasty cartel. So if you can notice from this electoral map, I compared the vote results of the two major political contenders in 2016. The red portions of the map describe the votes of Marcos Jr. when he ran for vice president. Those in pink were the votes of Leni Robredo, who won the vice presidency over Marcos Jr. in 2016. That is on the left of the slide. On the right is the electoral political map of the Philippines in the 2022 presidential elections that also featured a battle between Marcos Jr. and Leni Robredo, the main opposition candidate, this time for the presidency. And if you can notice, there is a glaring change that because, and one of the factors basically is because of Sara Duterte's decision not to run for president and instead be the running mate of Marcos Jr. By doing so, the Marcos Duterte ticket has effectively generated enough votes both in the northern frontier of the country as well as they call it the solid north, as well as Duterte's homeland, the Duterte dynasty's homeland in the south. And you can notice that the pink votes have significantly reduced to almost in the center of the country, with Leni Robredo simply capturing only a few regions of the Philippines compared with Marcos Jr. So the 2022 elections was not at all very different from the 2016 elections and previous elections because it also featured personality-based politics wherein who the candidate is matters more than what is the candidate's platform. However, the big difference is that I would say that the 2022 election campaign featured a condition of hardship for a lot of Filipinos given the long and militarized lockdown that prevented Filipinos from doing their jobs and generating livelihood. So therefore, their position of hardship makes them very vulnerable to a pretty much standard feature of Philippine elections, and that is vote buying. Economic recovery is also a main issue, as well as corruption, but less so is the Philippine foreign policy towards China and the United States. What we saw also in the 2022 election campaign is the proliferation of disinformation narratives, not only in traditional media, but also in social media and traditional media. As you can see here, we try to identify some of these disinformation narratives, and all of this tended to favor Marcos Jr. For me, the primary ones is authoritarian nostalgia, the notion that Marcos Jr. will bring back the so-called golden years of martial law under the presidency of his father. This resonated a lot to a lot of voters, particularly when the legacy of martial law as well as Philippine democracy has been heavily criticized, and the legacy of martial law has been propped up by Rodrigo Duterte. Marcos Jr. was also seen as exhibiting some of the characteristics of strong men that included not only his father, but Rodrigo Duterte. There were also some falsehoods in the campaigning that tended to put a positive light to Marcos, but at the same time puts a negative light to all the other candidates. So if you can notice, according to public opinion polling, there's been an increase in the positive appreciation of martial law, but at the same time, a negative evaluation of EDSA People Power, according to Pulse Asia surveys. And according to Check.ph, during the election campaign, most of the fact-check disinformation narratives tended to positively put Marcos in a positive light, while opposite of that is the negative appreciation of Corazon Aquino. This also had correspondence with the fake news that proliferated in the elections, with Marcos Jr. having around 90% of all the disinformation narratives or disinformation posts that Check.ph fact-checked. On the other hand, Leni Robredo, the main opposition candidate, received 94% of negative disinformation or fake news. So it's almost the polar opposite. Now, to describe the first few months of the Marcos administration, we need to have a balanced view in order to appreciate the first few months of the Marcos Jr. administration. He adopted a business as usual approach to governance. He has, until now, an almost complete cabinet. I said almost complete because at present, the secretaries for health, national defense are still on a temporary basis. And some analysts are saying that this might be reserved for those who ran in 2022 elections but lost, because there is a one-year ban for all those who have lost in the candidacies that they ran in the last elections. The cabinet featured a mixture not just of loyalists to the Marcos family, but some technocrats and even some members of previous cabinets that included the cabinets of former presidents Arroyo and even Aquino, Benigno Simeon Aquino. COVID-19 disruptions were minimized, and the Philippines actually did not have a COVID surge despite the election campaign in 2022. And I think with not just this is a government effort, but economic growth trajectory is way on track. What a lot of observers have said is that unlike his predecessor, Marcos does not engage in late-night tirades that become scary policies. However, many foresee that Marcos is not as visible, accessible, and present, unlike his predecessor, and some has described so far his administration of being an empty chair. There's also no concrete economic recovery roadmap, despite Marcos having traveled for almost 9 or 10 times since he became president. And it seems that economic hardship has become a new normal. There's also an absence of clear policy plans until now. His government still doesn't have a national security policy, although his government has I think, already published the Philippine Development Plan. There are also some unnecessary policy ideas, such as the Sovereign Wealth Fund, that has stirred up some controversy as being supposedly a way to pump prime the economy, but there have been many red flags about the creation of Sovereign Wealth Fund, given the context of the Philippines, and also because of the baggage with the way the last time the country was headed by a Marcos as president. Marcos also enjoys a supermajority in both houses of Congress, and therefore this questions the ability of Congress to act as an oversight and as a checker and balancer of executive power. As you can notice, this is the latest performance ratings of top officials. I want you to focus on Marcos and Sara Duterte, who both have very high performance ratings. Sara Duterte almost mirrors the performance rating of her father, and Marcos is only slightly below Sara Duterte's performance ratings. But if you can notice, the lowest performance ratings of Marcos is concentrated in the National Capital Region in Metro Manila, and also with the upper and middle classes. But you can see that these high trust ratings are an extension of their widely popular mandate. Marcos got 59% of the vote, while Sara Duterte got 62% of the vote in the vice presidency. And in a way, the first few months is often called the honeymoon period, being extended to all these government officials. I want to also emphasize that the challenges of the Marcos administration and the Marcos-Duterte alliance has something to do with gut or material and economic issues. So, for example, of all the national issues, Filipinos tended to focus less on politics and security issues, but more on increasing the pay of workers, reducing poverty, and creating more jobs, as well as controlling inflation. And if you can notice, controlling inflation is the top issue, but also in their assessment in this survey by Pulse Asia, you can see that the government has a negative performance rating as far as controlling inflation is concerned. This is the only issue that the Marcos administration has a negative performance rating compared to the very positive ratings on its performance on other issues. So what are the challenges and prospects? We know that many years ago, some might not have anticipated that the president of the Philippines will be a Marcos. But for many of us who have been monitoring Philippine politics, we knew that it only will take time before the Marcos dynasty comes back to power, because they have been very patient in their drive to come back to the apex of political power in the Philippines. And it's a combination of both their own efforts, the efforts of President Duterte to prop up authoritarian and populist leadership or liberal leadership, as well as the ability of and the role of luck. If Sara Duterte, as I mentioned, decided to run for president, the Marcoses would have a more difficult time. So from the very populist Joseph Estrada to the technocratic Gloria Arroyo, and from the liberal Benigno Aquino to the autocratic Rodrigo Duterte, the past year in the Philippines, the past year, which is an election year, historically felt like a changing of the guard that introduced discontinuities at the center of Philippine politics. However, the election of the Marcos Duterte ticket signals the viability and sustainability, perhaps, of a dynasty cartel among previously competing families. There is certainly a favorable and resilient illiberal political climate in the Philippines right now, and all metrics on the quality of democracy has put the Philippines in either an eroding democracy or highly defective democracy. In conclusion, in 2022, the dance of the dynasties in the Philippines was curiously not a conflict, but an alliance between the two most powerful families, political families in the Philippines right now, the Marcoses and the Dutertes. In replacement of an anarchy between families, there was a willingness to share power between notorious political clans. But it appears that the two dynasties' relentless pursuit of legacy, both the Dutertes and the Marcoses, might also drive them apart in the future. In the coming political intramurals may shape up to be more than a nuisance to the lives of Filipinos, because, to modify a famous African proverb, whether dynasties fight or collude in the Philippines, the people inevitably suffer. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks very much for that most interesting update, Aries. So my take is that politics in action in the Philippines is pretty much, or has pretty much been, politics as usual, which is actually really interesting as when viewed in light of the resilience that you just mentioned. We've got time for 10 minutes of Q&A. We have one question from the attendees in the audience. But before I go to that question, I might ask a preparatory question, referring back to the nostalgia for the dictatorship that you mentioned, Aries. This one has been written about frequently in not just in popular media, but also in the scholarly literature, and this nostalgia for the dictatorship, it really has me scratching my head. Would you, or has your research uncovered any reasons for the drivers of this nostalgia? Why is there so much nostalgia for it?
Thank you, Sandra. Of course, I think this question cannot just be addressed from the point of view of political science. I do think that this is a phenomenon where the intersection of all the spheres of Philippine political life intersects. So I think there are even economic reasons behind the authoritarian nostalgia. And this has something to do with the inability of Philippine democracy to bridge the gap between democratization and economic performance. So for a lot of Filipinos, democracy hasn't produced the necessary consequential benefits, because after all, democracy is not just being pursued for its own sake. It is pursued because it creates a better atmosphere for economic growth and equitable development. And unfortunately, economic inequality in the Philippines remains high. And as well as the Philippines might even be a middle income country now, maybe lower middle income country, but this is being driven by the 1%. More than a bulk of the middle class. The middle class in the Philippines mostly have voted with their feet rather than engaging in politics, and therefore making a contribution both to the political viability of the country's democracy. There are also those that say that this is really, and our susceptibility to disinformation narratives on authoritarian nostalgia exposes the education crisis in the Philippines. That we were unable, unlike other countries, South Korea, for example, even Taiwan, to put authoritarianism in its rightful place in the collective memory and political discourse in the Filipinos. Textbooks, we have seen, not only paints martial law as positive, but you can only find a page about martial law in a history book. So the history book audit by some of the historians from the University of the Philippines revealed glaring regulation deficits on the part of government to ensure that curriculum concerning martial law is effectively taught. And finally, I think politically, it's the lack of accountability and impunity. In countries like Latin America, authoritarian nostalgia only had very limitations because those who were culpable for the years of under dictatorship were made accountable. Examples would be like Chile, Argentina. They had truth commissions. They were able to make the perpetrators of human rights violations accountable. And in fact, we're the polar opposite. We have never made anyone accountable. There was a Marcos human rights compensation bill. We paid off the victims, but there's not enough truth telling. And this fed this authoritarian nostalgia.
Thank you, Ars. That's really interesting points. Specifically to your point and the role of disinformation in the lead up to the elections, we now have a related question from the audience. Some scholars and studies are arguing that the proliferation of fake news, myth-making, and historical revisionism are not to be fully blamed for the victory of Marcos Jr. Would you agree that there might actually be a chance that majority of Filipinos voted for him with full knowledge and awareness of the atrocities during his father's presidency and the baggage that come with his last name due to post-EDSA fatigue? In what way has the Duterte administration's efforts in demonizing the opposition also contributed to Marcos Jr.'s win and Robredo's loss? Very interesting question. Thanks very much.
Indeed. I agree with the premise of the question. The counterfactual is that if there was no social media existing, if this was an election in the late 80s or in the early 90s when there was barely internet in the country, would Marcos still have won? I would say that social media and the fake news amplified the Marcos revisionist narrative. But even prior to the advent of social media in Philippine political life, the ability of the Marcoses to revise history has always been there. It has always been present. So to say that social media was not the critical factor, I agree. But it amplified, it made it easier for disinformation narratives to reach Filipinos because we're the most digitally wired society. The internet for many Filipinos is social media. And the fantastic research of AIM and everyone else looking into this have said that if you make social media more accessible and you lack the regulation infrastructure, then this is the case. I also want to touch on the assumption of that there might be some condescension when we analyzed that social media was a factor because Filipinos are not stupid to just believe all these narratives. I also agree with that. I mean, I do think that Filipinos have the ability to engage in critical thinking, but in a recent study by Imelda Deinla and others on the Filipino youth, their study revealed that the Filipino youth are quite confident in saying that they know what's fake or not. But actually, when they were quizzed and there was a survey experiment, a lot of them failed the quiz. So in a way, I agree that Filipinos are thinking, they're thinking voters, and therefore they might have embraced Marcos for all his flaws, which we tend to do with our politicians. So I think the structural context of the 2022 elections also comes into play. As I said, it was a year of hardship. And if you don't have a job, if you have barely food to eat, if all you rely upon is the assistance from government, a candidate that promises you 20 peso rice per kilo of rice, and all of these wonderful promises and invokes an authoritarian past of the glory days, then you won't think twice. So I think the structural context is important, but we must not also belittle the role of social media and, I would say, the lack of critical thinking of many, I will not say all, but many Filipinos.
Thanks, Aris. It is indeed a highly complex issue, and it's almost like a spaghetti bowl of many interconnecting issues. I'm mindful of time, so we have one last question from the audience. What are the prospects then for the opposition in future elections, Aris? What's the way forward? Is there a way out of this dance of the dynasties that you spoke of?
Unfortunately, the opposition could not get their act together in the 2022 elections, similar during the midterm elections in 2019. It was very unfortunate. But I would also like to emphasize that the Duterte administration made it very, very difficult for the opposition. So there are limitations on the ability of the opposition from the center to the left and even parts of on the right of the political spectrum to unify. The specter of a Marcos presidency was not enough to put up a united front. But we have seen this in other countries, that if there is an existential threat candidate, that there would be an attempt to put up a united front. We have not seen this. In fact, there was a lot of mudslinging among the other candidates. And in fact, the opposition candidate, Leni Robredo, was not only attacked by those who supported the Marcos Duterte ticket, but also by other political dynasties and political elites. So this ganging of the opposition has many sources. You could trace that to the failures of democratization and of the failures of liberal democracy in the Philippines. But we must not discount the fact that Rodrigo Duterte assaulted the opposition. And until now, some opposition leaders are still incarcerated, like Senator De Lima. Some members of the Free Press, which is very important in the Philippines, have been harassed. I mean, Nobel Peace Laureate Maria Ressa, and members of civil society in the Philippines, even academics like myself, are red tagged and are even painted as enemies of the state, which is, not only myself, but there are worse cases from my colleagues in the academe, is not only unfair, but is even life-threatening.
Wow. These are indeed very interesting times and a very interesting point in Philippine political history, Aris. Thank you very much for sharing your very insightful talk. We are sadly out of time, and as always, time always runs out at that most interesting point in the conversation. But thank you very much for ending our Politics in Action series with a bang today, Aris. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we very much look forward to seeing you all at future SEAC events. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.